Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV, Alternative Media Television. It is, of course, December 3rd, 2014 on a Wednesday. And I did a report a couple days ago on the real reason oil and gas prices are dropping across the globe. And I explained that really what this is a hit against Russia, U.S. and Western interests to destabilize the Russian government, also put pressure on Iran and their nuclear program, more than it has to do with Saudi Arabia choosing not to cut production in order to stabilize prices and put fracturing companies here in the United States out of business. Although there might be some truth to that, it's not the real reason, it's not the real geopolitical play, and it's not the real chess move. And something that I wanted to touch on today that some of you probably picked up on, but I forgot to mention, and something that I've looked at specifically since 2008, is that I find it extremely interesting and also strategic that since 2008, the U.S. has increased its production supply of oil a gigantic 50%. This is a result of the astounding shale oil and gas revolution. Of course, I've spoken about at length this fracturing and horizontal drilling that we're seeing in states like Texas. But we've had this massive strategic increase in production, a gigantic move of 50% since 2008. Isn't it interesting that the U.S. suddenly comes out of nowhere and decides to be a major producer of oil post the 2008 financial collapse? At the same time, they managed to steal trillions and trillions of dollars from the American people in the form of bailouts, in the form of these very aggressive market moves that, of course, put many people on the street. Many people lost their businesses, lost their homes in foreclosure, short sale, etc. And also production in states like Texas doubled in a matter of just a few years. In 6 years, oil production in states like Oklahoma, Texas, and North Dakota doubled. That's absolutely incredible. Now, this report I'm reading here says without this energy blitz, the U.S. economy would barely have recovered from the recession of 2008-09. From the beginning of 2008 through the end of 2013, the oil and gas extraction industry created more than 100,000 jobs, while the overall job market shrank by 970,000. So here we are, several years post the 2008 collapse. We've gone from a nation that was dependent on OPEC and largely the Middle East for oil, one of the reasons we've been militarily involved in countries like Iraq, for example, to becoming the largest producer in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia in just a few years starting in 2008, namely due to these new ways of fracturing oil and gas in states like Texas. It also has created a tremendous amount of jobs. And now we have the price per barrel of oil dropping to really record lows, at least in recent years, what we've seen in recent years, with the price of oil up close to $200 a barrel leading up to the 2008-2009 crash. Taking a look at the oil markets today, we have Brent crude trading at 70, which is an indicator of more geopolitical risk and more specifically looks at OPEC producing nations. And then, of course, we have the Western Texas Intermediate crude, which is a little bit more U.S. dependent, and that's trading at around $67 a barrel. Now, of course, I've talked about how there's break-even points, not just for fracturing companies here in the United States, but for countries. And economists will tell you that under $100 a barrel of oil in places like Iran and Russia is disastrous for their economies. And under what we're seeing today, under $80 a barrel, $70 a barrel. I've read reports saying we could go as low as the 40s, maybe even the 30s temporarily. And a Saudi Arabian official today said that they think it's going to stabilize around $60 a barrel, even if it drops further in the short run, is catastrophic for countries like Russia and Iran that just happen to be enemies of the United States. You see, all of this, of course, is strategic. This is a part of the geopolitical chess move, and it isn't an accident, nor is it a coincidence, nor is it aimed to help consumers here in the United States, although we could argue that Americans will at least temporarily benefit from this. But what pundits aren't really expressing, and I don't think are focusing enough on, are the extreme geopolitical risks as a result of this. The ruble, for example, has lost, I've read, up to 60% of its value, the Russian ruble, against the US dollar in just the past year or so as a result of very heavy economic sanctions on Russia. We've had similar events transpire with the Rial and Iran. Both of these countries arguably, if not in recessions, in depressions as a result. And expectations for inflation in Russia, for example, in the double digits next year. And also, they revised GDP from 0 in 2015 to a negative print, to a negative number. So not only are prices falling, but inflation is rising and their currency is weakening as a result of these U.S. economic sanctions and this price pressure revolving around oil. Now, the problem with this is if oil drops below $100 a barrel, where it is today, if it drops below, 80, and then we're trading here in the 70s or even lower, this makes it impossible for countries like Russia and Iran to subsidize their economy and also their people. They can no longer subsidize energy. They can no longer subsidize housing. They can no longer subsidize food. And I've read some reports on this. The Russian economy, for example, is so heavily dependent, as well as OPEC producing nations and countries like Iran, are so dependent on oil in terms of growing their economy and allowing their governments to subsidize their people and their economy, that this is truly a catastrophic environment for America's enemies. And this, of course, is an act of war. And we always see economic acts of war largely before we see physical acts of war. And what's not being highlighted by the pundits, in my opinion, is that Russia, Iran, and U.S. enemies, China, also a friend of Russia, are going to respond to this. They are going to retaliate. Just like if the United States had economic sanctions put on them by these, what they would call rogue nations, the U.S. would respond, likely with war. So while there is a trade-off of Americans maybe filling up their trucks, their cars with cheaper gas and maybe some short-term savings, what they're not saying is that likely this is to move to a full-blown engagement in physical conflict in the not-too-distant future as Russia and these countries, other countries like Iran, enemies of the United States, will react in tandem, likely together. And I'm sure they're meeting on this right now on how they will respond to this. One thing that Putin could do, for example, is escalate tensions in the Ukraine. Of course, the United States has launched a massive propaganda campaign in the region and has basically convinced the American people that Putin has invaded Ukraine, even though that's the exact opposite of the reality. U.S. interests overthrew the Yanukovych government not too long ago through a coup, a U.S.-led coup. We've seen the same thing happen in the Middle East with the Arab Spring protests, the revolution and re-revolution in places like Egypt, for example, and the same thing was just done in Ukraine via the proxy of U.S. interests, of course, because they want their hands on natural gas exports. Gazprom, one of the large Russian companies that provide, I believe, somewhere up to 20 to almost 30% of natural gas exports to the European Union. You see how all this works, how all the money is funneled and how it's all connected, why the U.S. had a self-interest to overthrow the Yanukovych government into a more friendly Western-backed government, which is exactly what's happened and is since why they've ramped up the propaganda war. And I always find it funny how you'll always read reports in the mainstream media and the boob tube, places like CNBC, about how Russia has these large propaganda machines that make up their national media. Yet people believe, they're somehow convinced that we don't have the same propaganda machine here in the United States of America today. Of course, we know that that is not true. But to me, I think this signals a global depression, not just here in the States, but around the world. It's one of the reasons why oil prices have been manipulated lower. And specifically, U.S. interests and the West are fighting an economic war at the moment against their enemies, Russia and also Iran, namely. And of course, this is also why the president has amped up the wars. Remember, he said he was going to withdraw from, but he's actually reinvading and starting brand new ones in places like Iraq and Syria, where with his increased bombings, soon to be authorization of even more ground troops. See how he's no different than George W. Bush, but arguably much, much more dangerous. So please continue to watch oil prices. Again, this is a very large macro move. What I've explained today is the real reason why oil prices are dropping, why gas prices are dropping at the pump. In my opinion, has nothing to do with just simple supply and demand. Although that has been, and there has been some influence with this increased fracturing and production in the States. But all of this is much more connected to the New World Order strategy. Steal all the money in 2008, 2009, create and orchestrate the collapse. Once all of that money has funneled to the upper echelon of our society, the top 0.01% bankers that, again, created the problem, orchestrated the mess, engineered the securitization instruments, the phony bullshit mortgages in the first place. After that was done, they strategically go into the fracturing business. In 2008, we double our oil output in just a few years. Creates most of the jobs in an economy that is arguably in a depression here in the United States of America. And now we have OPEC deciding not to cut supplies, to continue to drive oil prices lower. And the question you need to ask is why? And the reason why is to put pressure on Russia to fight an economic war against Vladimir Putin. Of course, this has all been a part of the propaganda war, whether it's Edward Snowden in the leaks of this illegal wiretapping via the NSA from Edward Snowden, or it's oil prices. All this to put pressure on Putin, his government, Iran, the Ayatollahs, and our enemies and countries that we are currently still invading, like Iraq. This is all a part of the program, and it will lead to physical war, not just economic war. And I fear, as has been the historical track record of the United States, typically peaks and troughs mark times. Anytime there's a trough, that is usually stimulative for the economy. That usually precedes an economic expansion, and when prices are high in the oil markets, it typically precedes a recessionary period, a recessionary trough, and or a depression. Like what we've seen, for example, most recently in 2008 and 2009. But what I think is not just different this time, but really is just more of the same, is this will lead to another global war. Just like we had World War I, just like we had World War II, and I believe we're already engaged in World War III, and we are living through the brushstrokes of the economic war right now, this geopolitical war, chess game being fought via Western nations against enemies like Russia and Iran and countries like Iraq, for example. And of course, all this tension around Ukraine will soon lead to the next great war and the next great conflict. So if I were you, as I am doing myself, I would intently be following oil prices. I actually think that it's going to surprise many people, surprise economists. I think it shoots much lower before it stabilizes into the 60s, as a Saudi representative mentioned today. I think we could see oil go much, much lower in the short run before we see stabilization. And it will be, mark my words, catastrophic for countries like Russia and Iran. And they will react. They will respond, just like the United States would if the rules were reversed. Again, all of this a part of the plan, all of this a part of the engineered strategy to integrate the global economy into one economy, into one global nation state. As we lose our autonomy, Obama opens up the borders, authorizes up to 5 million new illegals here in the United States, anti-constitutionally, an act of a king. All of this is about destroying our borders and integrating nations into a cohesive unit. Kind of like what we saw with the European Union, which is a perfect example of a failed integration that has failed miserably in just a few short years. I think the European Union has only been around for, what, less than 10 years, something around that ballpark, and it's already literally disintegrated in a depression in this part of the world. And, you know, it's just a taste, a little bit of a taste of what you can expect as we move forward into 2015. I'm Christopher Green. Get this video out everywhere. Make it viral. Hard hitting it in your face. And click the link below to support our sponsor.